Hello, and thank you for joining me. My name is Claire Wansbury. I'm an Atkins Fellow and Technical Director at Atkins, working in the UK. I'm an ecologist with over 30 years' experience, but over the last 10 years, I've been working increasingly on the new ways we look at our interaction with nature. So approaches like biodiversity net gain and natural capital valuation. And this is the first and the introduction to a series of sessions that Constructive Voices and I have put together to help you get your head around biodiversity net gain. And in this introduction, I'll be talking a little about what that concept is and introducing what you're going to be able to find in this wider series. Basically, this is going to create a free learning centre where you can listen to lots of recordings, find material, or just dip in and out and find a single recording on a concept or a case study or something that you think, I need to know more about that. It's a fast-moving field, and hopefully we're just going to build more and more information as time goes on, because there's so much to learn, and for biodiversity net gain to be a force for good, we all need to get behind the concept and do it well. So, what actually is biodiversity net gain? Put simply, the concept means development that leaves biodiversity, our natural range of species and habitats and ecosystems, development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than it was before that development project happens. So the natural world is better off because of a development scheme. And obviously in the past, development projects have damaged nature, whether it's something really big, losing a large area of habitat, or, as in many cases, you look and think, well, these are tiny projects, they're not doing much damage, but actually when you put them all together, cumulatively, significant harm has been caused. And why this is so important to do something is that we've been living through a global nature loss emergency. So across the UK where I live and across the world, we've seen habitat areas shrinking, all sorts of indirect harm, and extinctions of species at a rate that hasn't been seen on this planet since the time that the dinosaurs became extinct. When you look at it in that context, it's terrifying. And the fact that it's something we have caused as humans is really daunting, and you can think, well, what on earth can we do? There's lots that can be done. And the goal that the United Nations and many, many individual countries have signed up to is to say the decade we're in now, up to 2030, is when we want to turn the corner and change from being a time of biodiversity loss to move into a time of nature restoration. Internationally, you'll hear the term nature positive being used. And in England, specifically, biodiversity net gain is a key tool to help us change to a nature positive future. It's not the whole story. It's one tool in a toolkit that we need to use. But it should be a really valuable one if it's done well. So that's the context. That's why we're talking about nature restoration. Why we're talking with Constructive Voices specifically about biodiversity net gain right now is in England, it's shortly going to become mandatory for almost all construction projects covered by the Town and Country Planning Act. This has come about through legislation, the Environment Act, which became law in 2021. And we're recording these in the period running up to the secondary legislation that will make it mandatory across the whole of England. This isn't an absolutely new concept right now. Similar types of approaches have been experimented with other countries. So biodiversity offsetting has been used for wetlands in some parts of the United States of America, for a variety of habitats in Australia, and other examples across the world. Biodiversity Net Gain has also been trialled in different parts of England over the last decade. So some developers, some I've been working with very closely, have been using it in a voluntary way on their projects. And certain local authorities have introduced local systems requiring it. So that's why we're looking at it right now, and how it relates to that global challenge of nature loss. And with it coming in, obviously this is being triggered by legislation. There's going to be a legal driver for it. But one of the things we'll be covering in this series of conversations is the importance of not just seeing this as a tick box exercise. It's an opportunity to do it right, so it's benefiting nature and benefiting people, our society and our economy in many different ways as well. And something you think about it, this should be really exciting time, because this is an opportunity to create the exemplars that the world can learn from. If you think about how we used to doing development projects where wildlife could be affected, then we try and reduce the harm, compensate for the harm, but you end up with potentially harm that's just reported, and then the decision is made, do we go ahead through processes like EIA? Biodiversity Net Gain is looking to deliver a net benefit. It's not the only thing that needs to be thought about on a development project. You have to think about all of the existing legislation and policy, because biodiversity net gain is a tool, but it's a relatively blunt tool. It can't capture every single aspect of the natural world. So we still have to think, where are the really rare species? Where are the key wildlife corridors? Where are the real opportunities to do good in ways that maybe aren't captured through BNG? Which obviously BNG is short for biodiversity net gain, and look for those and find them. Putting all of these tools together, we can create a nature positive future. In this series, we'll be looking at some of the key concepts embedded within biodiversity net gain. So there's a mathematical metric that you use to calculate it. It's habitat-based metric, which is why I mentioned earlier that there are some aspects of nature that it doesn't capture, like particularly rare species. It also isn't just about doing the maths. It's a mindset and it's an approach where you're looking to see what can we do to make things better. And the starting point of that, which is a really key thing, which we'll have a session on definitely a little later in this series, is a concept called the mitigation hierarchy. And to me, the mitigation hierarchy is just plain common sense. Those of you who've dealt with carbon management will be familiar with these concepts, because it's the common sense approach of saying, okay, we want to do a thing, a development, any sort of project, and think, well, where's the best place to do it? Can we find somewhere that avoids harm altogether, where we're not going to cause habitat loss in the first place? Or at least, can we avoid the harm to the most distinctive, the most species-rich habitat types. Where you can't avoid harm altogether, which will happen, what can you do to mitigate that, to minimize it, to reduce the harm as much as possible? And only when you've taken those steps do you look and say, okay, here's the harm that's predicted to happen that we can't avoid. And there's still going to be some harm, though we've reduced it as much as possible. Now what do we do to compensate for it? What can we restore or create on-site as compensation? And then the very final step is to say, okay, we've still got something we can't compensate for on-site. Let's look off-site. First looking locally and then further afield for opportunities to compensate. And that's the mitigation hierarchy. But what's critical about biodiversity net gain is the end point that you're aiming for isn't just compensating. It's not just getting back to a point of no net loss. It's saying we're going to go beyond that. What's been put in the legislation is using the biodiversity metric to require a 10% net gain. And I know some people have asked me why 10%? What's the science behind that? And there isn't a massively in-depth, it's not like 10% that's okay, that will save us, that will get us to our nature positive future. 10% gives us a margin for error comfort zone that means we can be really confident that we're going beyond no net loss. And definitely doing some positive results. However, if you can do a project that goes beyond 10% and does more, go for it, basically. 10% is what's mandatory in the legislation, but it doesn't stop you going beyond that, looking for more opportunities. And obviously, if you think about it, if you've got a site that's really nature poor, that's maybe just got tiny little bits of retained habitat areas that aren't very valuable in themselves, as your starting point, then on a site like that, it's going to be really easy to go beyond 10%. And 10% of not very much is, by definition, not very much. So if you're starting with little, challenge to say, what can we do more? And always look and think, where can we add value? So I think for one of the key things for me is there's this mathematical metric that has to be completed by an ecologist, looking at the habitats before and afterwards. But it's important not to let the maths drive the design. It's so important to have thought about placemaking, what sort of habitat creation would be good for people who are going to live in a new housing development, or people who are going to be working in an area, and also what will create connectivity for mobile species like bats and badgers and birds and insects to move through a development site to other areas, either in an urban area or out into the wider countryside. This is a time of opportunities. So that's where we're at. Why have we created this series? It's basically to share, because there is a lot to learn. There are some excellent training courses out there. So, for example, if you're somebody like an ecologist who needs to apply this in the field and advise, I hope you will get some real inspiration and some real knowledge from this. But it won't give you the depth of understanding of how the metric works. You need to look at the guidance documents, you need to read them. There's also training available through SIME and other organisations. The SIME training I've done, and it's really good. even just the training, that's not enough in itself. You've got to be looking at the documentation and studying it to get your head around it as an ecologist. But some of the more complicated concepts we will be touching on in this series. And also, I've mentioned ecologists. This is not just something for ecologists to do. This is a team effort. We've got so much knowledge about how to do project design well. Engineers and architects looking at how to work around valuable areas of habitat, how to make the different parts of development work together, the master planners, the landscape architects. Getting all of these people together is going to be really important, and actually getting them together early in the process is vital, so that people are thinking, have we picked the right site? Rather than saying, here's our site, here's where the buildings will go, here's where the road will go, okay, ecology and landscape come in now. Tell us how to make the surrounding bits pretty. That's massive simplification, but you know what I mean. Getting them in from the start to say, how do we make this an environment-led design that does what's needed to meet the objectives of the development, while creating a place that is good for nature, but also good for the people that are going to be using it. Because something we've all seen, particularly in the lockdowns in COVID, was how important having good quality green space near to where you live and work is for our physical well-being and our mental well-being. There have been lots of scientific studies written up about that, but in the last few years, it's something we've all experienced as individuals. So that's a bit about the concept, that's a bit about the background, why we're talking about it, what you can achieve if you do it well. What we're going to be covering in this series is a real mixture. There are going to be some sessions where we're looking in depth at a particular concept. So the mitigation hierarchy, which I mentioned earlier, that's something we're going to be going into. We're going to have people sharing their knowledge and their own experience, both individuals talking about their engagement with Biodiversity Net Gain and sharing their knowledge, and also people sharing case studies, so some of the real exemplars of good practice that are so valuable to learn from. I think one of the things that struck me is everybody who's speaking in this series is passionate about Biodiversity Net Gain being done well and being a force for good, and they're also passionate about helping other people learn, so we can learn from each other's experience, because we will obviously, everybody learns through their mistakes, but this is also novel. It's really important to share about good things and about challenges, so that other people learn from our own learning. So that's where we're at, that's what we're going to be doing. And I'm not going to tell you how many episodes there are in a series. We've got a great set of recordings that we'll be sharing with you. But keep coming back to the list, because the plan is we're going to add more over time. Because this isn't something that you just learn now, and that's it, you've learnt it. We will all be learning as we go on the journey using Biodiversity Net Gain and the other tools to create a toolkit that takes us to a nature-positive future. So welcome. I hope you've enjoyed that very high-level introduction to the theme and what we're going to be talking about, and I hope you'll be joining us for as many of these sessions as possible.